Excuse me. Okay. Oh. Okay. Leave it on the question slide for a sec. Okay. Oh boy. Here we go. Okay. All right. So today we're going to keep going talking about secularization. We're going to try to make a mile and get through as much of it as we can. The time is short. Midterm grades are back. I already see some people have booked appointments with me. If you want to go over the results, do book an appointment. If you can't find an appointment time that works because everything's filled up or nothing works with your schedule, you can email me as well. I mean, I do have appointments 4 days a week, but I understand that despite my best efforts, I can't always make everybody's schedules work. But we can always figure something out, right? Okay. Good times. I got everything up and going. All right, so last time, I am trying to remember where we were. I think it was here. Yeah, it's like 11 days ago. Hello. Are we done, Erica? Is this it? Oh, that's good. Okay. I'm just kidding. It's not that I am tired. Okay. So we were talking about secularization, right? So we've gone through sort of 2.5 secularization theories, right? We've talked about the inherited model of secularization from our kind of classical sociological lens. Those are Marx, Durkheim, Weber. We talked about kind of the revised secularization model from Steve Bruce, right? He's not the only proponent of this, but I think his is a really good example, right? Well, which is basically secularization in the classical or inherited sense is still going to happen. We just got the timing wrong, right? So he calls it late secularization. And now we're into what I've called no secularization. Write for me, pen. I need you. Right, and this is Rodney Stark. And we're kind of going through his reasoning as to why he thinks there's no secularization. And I think we ended off with this slide, right, showing, and this is from his 2015 book, The Triumph of Faith, right? It's written about a decade ago, where he suggested the world is more religious than ever. So far from that kind of Peter Berger assertion, right, which Berger did recant, that by the new millennium, this one, religion would be basically dead. Religion is doing just fine, right? And if we take out China, because sometimes we can't trust the numbers in China, right? It's like almost 2/5 of the world is Christian, almost 1/3 of the world is Muslim, almost 1/4 of the world is Hindu, and 5% is Buddhist, and with some other religions in there for spare change. Not big amounts. And only 1% is truly secular if we take out China. I mean, that's still 29 million people, but whatever. Okay, so I think maybe I talked about this. I don't remember now. I think I did. Doesn't hurt to go back a spell. All right, so his claim, right, is that the world was far more religious in 2015 than it was in 1950. Specifically, that you had a huge growth. And again, I think we can quibble with his numbers here. I think his numbers are on the high side for Christians in China. I would probably put the number closer to the bottom end of his range at about 100 million. Though I've seen some numbers as high as 300 million. I don't really believe those numbers, but somewhere in the range of between 100 100,000 and 250, sorry, 100 million and 250 million. I'm going to get this together at some point. Oh, hang on. That's my dad. I'll call you later. There we go. Hopefully it's not important. Yes, between 100 and 250 million. Again, I would put that number on the lower end. I think the number I trust the most is somewhere around 116 million. But, you know, a pretty big increase from 5 million in the 1950s, plus other religions in China, right? If we did a deep dive, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, all saw revivals and sort of increases in interest under not the current president of China, but the president just prior to him. So we've seen some like revival of interest in religious traditions in China, in kind of indigenous religious traditions, and growth in both Islam, mostly demographic, and Christianity, which is mostly conversion. Okay, and he says church attendance in Latin America was about 20% per week in the 1950s, and it's up over 50%, in 2015. So it's increased pretty significantly. And we can say this about both Muslims and Hindus. Muslims and Hindus are both more devoted than they were in the past. And we'll talk about each of them kind of in turn in very general terms, because he gives pretty general evidence here. Okay, so Europe, right? So his kicking boy is always Europe, right? He always likes to sort of try to tarnish that European evidence for secularization because, you know, it's important. Europe has always been the key piece of evidence for that secularization thesis. Modernity hits Europe first. They get secular the most quickly. So if you can prove that they're actually not that secular, it kind of works, right? It kind of breaks down that whole argument. So he admits church attendance is low in Europe. Why am I screaming? Why is this all in caps? I don't remember. Church attendance is low in Europe, but what he calls unconventional supernaturalism is thriving. So unconventional supernaturalisms, he says, flourish where church attendance is low. And what does he point to here? Beliefs in things like fortune tellers, right? And he lists some countries that we probably think is pretty secular. Here's the Netherlands, largely considered one of the most secular countries in the world. And what do we see? You know, belief in fortune tellers on this World Values Survey, 26%, 21% in astrology, and 19% in lucky charms. Now, these aren't what you would typically consider religious beliefs, but what Stark is saying is these are all beliefs in what you might call some kind of superhuman power, right? That the stars or fate or, that someone can look into your future, has like psychic powers to see the future, or that objects can, alter your luck, right? Maybe you didn't put on your lucky socks on Sunday morning and you're the reason Team Canada lost. I don't know. There you go. It's all your fault. It's you specifically. No, I'm kidding. Right, and we see this across the board, right? Pretty high levels of, the Swiss apparently 42% on that World Value Survey said they believe in astrology, the International Social Science or Social Survey Project out of 2008, right? And same thing in Eastern Europe, right, where these numbers are really high. Fortune tellers, astrology, lucky charms are really high, across the board. And again, these are all countries that were communist until 1991, right? So they had official communism, but we see a lot of unconventional supernatural beliefs. So Stark's question with anytime we see something like this, right? And anytime you see belief in souls or the afterlife or any of those things is, can we really call these societies secular, right? Where large percentages of the population have either conventional or unconventional supernatural beliefs, right? If 65%, or 68%, Czech Republic is also a very secular society. If 68% of Czechs say they believe in fortune telling, can we really say that that's secular? Or is that just a spirituality or a kind of religious belief that our tools in measuring religion are poorly aligned in detecting, right? Because we usually ask questions about belief in God, membership in a religious community, or church attendance, right? Things like prayer, scripture reading. But those are clearly not the only types of spiritual or religious beliefs that people can have. All of these would probably fit the bill as well. So, is this really a secular society? That's the big question that Stark has. And he comes down with the answer, no. That's actually not a secular society. That's a religious society that has adopted an unconventional set of religious beliefs that are really hard to measure. Okay. Or rather than being really hard to measure, it's something that sociologists don't commonly ask about. I'm now wondering if the Slido is working. Can someone put a comment in just to make sure? Because now I'm like, nobody had any questions after reading break. I find this hard to believe. Okay. Nothing. It's all broken. Oh, how tall am I? Awesome, 5'11", aspirationally. Maybe 5'10", depending on the day and how crushed I am by life. Aside from that. All right, let's talk Japan, because that's where Stark goes next, and yellow pen doesn't show up well on white, so let's go to green. Okay, so Japan. Japan is often held up as a prototypical secular country, right? One where most people, when asked if they belong to a religious tradition, answer that question in the negative. Again, here, what Stark says is that if we think about this slightly sideways, right? And we think about religion not necessarily just as, in the Western sense, do you go to church? Do you belong to a specific religious community? What we see out of Japan is a very, very different picture. So, what he says is that if we count actual religious membership statistics, they add up to more than 100% of the Japanese population, which means that a bunch of Japanese people are adopting practices from 2 or more Japanese religious traditions. But something like 90% of Japanese visit Shinto shrines typically at least once a year. About 90% have a Buddhist altar in their home, and only 11% claim to be atheists. The problem, though, is again in our tools. The religions in Japan are principally unchurched. I'm going to zap back really quickly to remind you, because it's been a bit, right? So unchurched religions and unchurched supernaturalisms lack organized congregations and lack a specific creed, right? So this is what he says we have in Japan. We have things like Shinto and Buddhism that don't tend to have organized congregations, don't tend to have a very specific creed. Thus, when we ask belonging questions in the standard Western-oriented way, people will report having no religion in Japan. However, Japanese life, according to Stark, is actually drenched in religious practices, right? And here, and I did not have to look very hard for this, somebody took their brand new Lexus over to a Shinto temple once they bought it to have it blessed, right? And apparently, when you buy property in Japan, there's a tax included to pay for a Shinto ceremony to purify the land spiritually, right? And so people frequently do seek kind of religious blessings. It's part of Japanese culture, right? This is part of what you do. But again, Stark says, okay, if people are going to a Shinto temple to have their car blessed, that is clearly a religious practice. Happens to overlap with culture, but can we really say that this is secular? And once again, he sort of comes down on the side of, no, actually, Japan is deeply religious, just not in the sense that you would think of like North America, right? Where you're like, do people go to church? Highly religious. Do they not go to church? Secular. Japan doesn't really fit that mold because the religions themselves don't fit the mold. Okay, and these are just fun, right? Do you regularly visit a family grave at least once a year, right? This is part of a lot of Asian kind of folk religions. So 75% of Japanese people say yes, a person's spirit remains with the family, right? So almost 60% of Japanese people here said yes as well. Do you pray on certain occasions when you need help? It's better than or almost 2/3 rather. Have you visited a temple recently to pray for a positive outcome in your life? That's a yes, more than half. So a majority. Do you keep good luck charm or amulet around you? Almost 2/3 yes, right? Do rivers and mountains have spirits, right? Again, almost 60% say yes. Do you think palm reading is a reliable way to tell the future? Well, a majority said yes. When a person is born and when a person dies are predetermined, right? So there's some kind of fate. And there we have almost 3/4, right? Again, interesting. Without reference to any established religion, do you believe it's important to have spiritual beliefs? And again, almost 3/4 of the population say yes, and only 14% say no. So again, the question being, oops, I missed a letter. Is this what a secular society looks like? And again, Stark would say no, right? These are all religious and spiritual beliefs. They're just not churched ones, right? They're not what you would think of as a churched religious system, so they don't fit the mold again. Okay. A little bit more on China. I already said most of this, so I'll go really quick. Right at the beginning of our communist era, right, there were somewhere around 5 million Christians in China. Christianity had a really hard time getting a foothold in China. It was mostly coastal, right? It was mostly where sort of missionaries had landed along with British, Dutch, and French traders. And often they were derided, as what we're called rice bowl Christians, right? They were poor and they were there for the free food that the missionaries would occasionally hand out. Okay, that said, after decades of official persecution and control by the Chinese government, certainly there are a lot more Christians in China. It is really, really, really hard to get a really good feeling of how many Christians there are in China because the Chinese government, A, doesn't allow outside polling agencies to come in and do work in China, especially demographic work for reasons that it's an authoritarian country. And a lot of Christians having faith, especially in what are called house churches, right? Unofficial churches, because there are official churches in China, but those who belong to these unofficial churches are often hidden, and if they're asked in social science research, are you a Christian? They're going to answer no, right? Or what's your religious identity? They're not going to say much, right? So, some estimates, right, put that number, again, between 100 and 250 million, and by some estimates, it's set to rise to somewhere between 200 and 350 million by 2030, right? Now, again, Stark was writing this prior to kind of the most recent wave of persecution. He wrote a book with a Chinese researcher called A Star in the East about Christianity in China, wherein, he found that Christianity was becoming particularly popular amongst young and college-educated young Chinese. Now this, I think, has somewhat reversed with the most recent kind of waves of prosecution, and the current Chinese government is far less friendly to religion than the last one was, right? President Xi seems to be much more of a fundamentalist communist, so these numbers have probably slowed, and it's made detection of Christians in China much more difficult. But, pretty good sense that Christianity is sort of slowly rising in China, and it'll probably hit somewhere, about 1/3 of the population. I might put it later than 2030 from some other estimates that I've seen, maybe somewhere around 2050, right? Maybe a little bit later. It'll hit somewhere around 1/3 of the population. So it's small enough now, and honestly pretty hidden, that a lot of people won't even notice it's there. But at some point, it's likely to become very visible. And yeah, by a lot of estimates, by 2050, China will be the country with the most Christians on Earth, right? So it'll have more Christians than Brazil or the United States. So interesting stuff. And yeah, religion in general, seems to have risen in China, especially again under the last Chinese premier, not President Xi. Oh, now I'm forgetting his name, the last Chinese premier. I want to say it's Hu Jintao, but I could be wrong about that. Was much more friendly, and there was a huge rediscovery of things like Taoism and Buddhism in particular. And the Chinese government has long favored Confucianism as its kind of preferred religion because it's historically Chinese, and there's no kind of outside influences on Confucianism that could cause political problems. Among the reasons Christianity isn't particularly loved by the Chinese Communist Party is that there's a whole global Christianity that often has, it's hard to control, right? There are missionaries. There's a pope in Rome that might want to tell the Chinese Catholics what to do, and the Chinese Communist Party doesn't particularly like this. Okay, so now this data is getting, 2 decades old, sadly. But what do we know about China? So from this 2007 Horizon study, and Horizon is the official polling agency of the Chinese government, 72% of those who said they had no religion during the past year venerated ancestral spirits by their grave. Okay. 10% of the same respondents, right? So these are the ones that they say they have no religion, believed in the Jade Emperor or God in heaven, right? 22% said they believe in Buddhism. These are the ones who say they have no religion, right? And they make a strong, distinction between church and unchurched religion. So again, is China really secular? It's hard to say, right? Because there's a lot of lingering spiritual beliefs, like ancestor worship or veneration, right? This is a spiritual or religious belief. Again, it's not one that you find, there's no I guess like in the movie Mulan, right? There's a little temple in their backyard where they go and venerate the spirit of the ancestors. But there's no general religion of, ancestor worship where you all go and do it at the same time. It's done at graves, it's done individually or on small scales. But they do have, a day for sweeping the graves of your ancestors, right? Where people go and kind of clean up the graves, bring food and drink and commune with the dead. Right? So again, is this a secular society? And again, I think what Stark will come down on is no. We might think of this as a secular society. Everybody is booking appointments as we speak. My watch is just like, bzz, bzz, bzz. You have an appointment booked. I'm like, okay, super. Right? No, I love appointments. It's wonderful. But it's just funny that it's all happening right now while I'm in class. But yes, is this a secular society? Again, there's reasons to kind of think maybe not, right? There's a lot of religious and spiritual activity under the surface, even in the country that we generally think of as super secular because of its political system in China. All right, the Hindu revival. Woo! Sorry, that's for Jasmine. We've talked about this before. She wrote a lovely paper on Hindu nationalism for me in a different class. So in children's cartoons, it was great. All right, so Hindu revival. So the first Prime Minister of India post, booting the British out was Nehru. And Nehru, like a lot of our Western educated folks who'd taken a class in sociology where we talked about Durkheim, Marx, or Weber. I actually have no proof that Nehru took a class where they talked about Durkheim, Marx, or Weber. Oh, do fuck off. Sorry. All right, we're just going to turn you off for the moment because you're bothering me. Ugh. Okay, power off. Usually my phone, it's like spam calls, and my dad and my son's like, can you order me food because he's homesick today? I'm like, no, none of these things. Good day. All right, so Nehru, right? Western educated guy, first Prime Minister of India, followed that same kind of thinking that industrialization would erode the influence of religion. And what has actually happened in India seems to be the opposite. As India has modernized, it's actually gotten more religious, right? Or at least the intensity of the religiosity seems to have grown significantly. And I mean, Stark is writing before really the current Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, comes in. Modi is a Hindu nationalist and has really, really pushed strongly for, sort of revival of Hinduism, and Hinduism as explicitly linked to Indian identity, which has caused a few problems. Okay, so in 2015, about 80% of India's population identified as Hindu. 67% of Indians said they had attended a religious service in the past week. That's 2/3, right? 85%, so that's a huge majority, right, said religion was important in their daily lives. Hinduism obviously is the big religion. Obviously Christianity, Sikhism, Islam, Jainism, right? There's a bunch of religions active in India, but the big one is Hinduism. We don't really know the origins, right? We think it's probably somewhere around 3,500 years old. And in a sense, calling Hinduism a religion is probably wrong. It's more like a religion of religions, right? It's a combination of a bunch of different local belief systems into sort of a cohesive pantheon of gods and beliefs. And it's really, really complex because it's developed over 3,500 years. Okay, now that said, it has sort of three types of religious texts, or three sets: the Vedas, I cannot say these words, Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. I said that wrong, I'm sorry, I can never get that one right. Now, when it comes to the revival, right, what seems to have happened is that industrialism or industrial development hasn't led to the decline or the demise of Hinduism, right? So, in India at least, modernity doesn't seem to be equal to secularization. Quite the opposite. The Indian scholar Mirananda suggested actually globalization was making India more Hindu, and specifically sort of a distance from the British Raj, right? And the kind of encounter with colonial Western powers had sort of pushed Indians to embrace Hinduism as a sort of opposite to particularly global Western secular modernity as a set of norms, right? And there's a lot of cultural kind of backlash still in India about, colonialism and British and Portuguese rule of India, right? So they've pushed back, and as they've integrated more globally, you see a lot more Hindu faith going on. Okay, just a few little numbers here that he cites to show the kind of increase in kind of devotion. In 1986, you had about 3 million Indians visiting the Vaishno Devi shrine. I'm sorry, I said that wrong again. Vaishno Devi shrine. By 2000, that number was up to 5 million. 2012, it had doubled to 10 million. And this is pretty consistent in shrines across India. Now, it's worth noting, this has also coincided with a period where India has gotten a lot richer, right? Where it's possible for Indians to travel a lot more because they have more money, right? They're more able to make accommodations. But I think even that sort of suggests that along with increased wealth and modernization has come, some kind of increase in devotion to religion. Okay. Moral of the story is don't persecute Christians unless you want a problem that never goes away. More than that, or more on that later. We'll talk about that when we talk about the rise of Christianity. Okay, so national survey conducted in 2007 found that 33% of Indians reported becoming more religious in the past 5 years, right? So again, the 2000s is the period where India's economy really picked up, right? And this is where, people started talking about the BRICS on an economics perspective, the I being India as the kind of rising economic powers. It was Brazil, Russia, India, China, Some people have put the S as South Africa. I just usually think it's plural because BRIC sounds stupid, but BRICS, just makes it plural. But Brazil, Russia, India, China, all were rising economically in major ways. And so in this period, right, a third of Indians reported becoming more religious. So again, as modernity kind of bit and really blasted forward, India got more religious. Only 5%, said they'd become less religious. And not for nothing, and Modi has played a role in this in more recent years, we've seen rising conflict in India between Hindus and other minorities. And what do we see here? Income and importance of religion. And this is a wider point that Stark wants to make, which again, I'll talk about later when we talk about the rise of Christianity. What he says is, well, we often, and here he wants to take a kick at our buddy Uncle Carl, right? And deprivation theory. I will forever call him Uncle Carl, right? So you remember deprivation theory, the idea that, religion only exists because of material deprivation. Stark has always hated this idea, and, in this book, he still makes the case that this is wrong. And why? Well, he says, actually, the people most likely to be religious, right, are actually the upper classes, right? Upper class people, and we talked about this earlier, right? It's the European nobility that really drive forward Christianity in Europe, while the peasants never really cared that much. So our upper class are the most likely to pray, significantly more likely than lower classes. And the percentage who say religion is very important, the upper class are the only ones in a majority position. The rest are a strong plurality, but not a majority, according to our 2006 World Values Survey. So, again, he's making a wider point, attacking Marx's deprivation theory, actually saying it's rich people that are interested in religion. Why? Because they've met their basic needs and now they can actually think about spiritual questions. But again, more on that later. Okay, we'll do this really quickly. I have a much wider kind of religion in America, religious landscape thing later in the course. But basically tracking here, saying that, percentage who attend church weekly really has not varied in America very much. From 1974 to 2014, it was about a third in 1974, and it kind of goes up and down. It sort of troughs out in 1996 for some reason, and then kind of bounces back. But the variation is all, really within 6 or 7 points. So there hasn't been a huge change, and this is GSS data and Baylor Religion Survey and World Values data. Okay, so we are done with Stark now, for the moment. Hoy boy. All right, let's talk about a different model of secularization. Specifically, we're going to talk about the model that I refer to as neo-secularization, because we need to give it an official title, and this one works. Okay, so what does everybody agree on when it comes to secularization, right? And this I would take, if we talk about our modern scholars of secularization, we could take anyone from someone like Steve Bruce all the way through like Stark, Anacones, Roger Fink, the kind of Starkian crew, and then people like Christian Smith, Mark Chavez, we're going to talk about in a sec, who all kind of fit into this neo-secularization mode. So even the biggest critics of secularization, like Stark, will agree that social changes associated with modernity impacted religion, right? There's no question that religion looks different today than it did in the past. Even Stark, right, he'll say, we've gone from churched religions to unchurched religions, from church supernaturalisms to unchurched supernaturalisms, right? Or conventional supernaturalism to unconventional supernaturalism, right? Religious authority definitely doesn't dominate all different spheres of public life the way it did in the past, right? The church is not, in, say, a Western sense, at the center of society, right? It is one institution amongst many. But the question becomes, is modernity synonymous with religious decline, or has religion just changed in character as society has changed in character, right? And largely, we can see this lining up with what Stark said. We maybe have different forms of religious belief, but religion isn't gone. So clearly, it seems modernity isn't toxic to religion, right? This formulation that modernity is going to put the gods into retirement isn't true, because we're well into 300 years of modernity and religion's still kicking, right? But religion, the scope of religion is definitely different than it was. Okay. So, going back to Parsons and Bella, what they thought was that secularization is part of increasing social complexity. And very specifically, so they think of it as religious evolution. When you get more modernity, right, religion goes from being a much more public matter to a much more private matter, right? Something that people just don't talk about. It's not at the center of their lives externally. It's something that's much more private. So they don't think this is a negative change, right? It's not like straight up religion is going away, or that it's bad for society or anything like that. It's just a change. Now, one thing that they say, and I think this is really, really interesting, is that as we enter modernity, and you kind of get this if you go back to that Harwas, Stanley Harwas quote from the beginning of this unit, which I know seems like a million slides ago, and it sort of is. What happens in modernity, right, is people are free to choose their own beliefs. And they say, rather than being indoctrinated, right, rather than having beliefs sort of forced into you as a child and you adopt those because it is part of the tribe that you're part of, right, increasingly people choose their own beliefs. But this may very well, for religion, kind of be a good thing. Because religion that's chosen, right, rather than one that's handed down, is going to be one that's much more important and much more intense for the individual, right? Why? Because you've chosen it, right? Because you've actually made a positive choice to deal with this religion, to be part of this religion. You're going to invest more of yourself in it. Okay, and for Parson and Bella, right, in the West, oops, I'm scribbling over my own words, Christian ideas will continue to have influence even as organized Christianity is less important, right? And this is causal mechanism number 10, which is deep culture and invisible religion, right? Right there. Okay. Now, Parson and Bella are kind of the first one to do this jujitsu move when it comes to secularization that Stark is really critical of in Rip Secularization. But Parson and Bella say, if secularism is defined as that process by which religion decreases in importance, by which it has less influence on one's worldview and social behavior, then they say, well, yeah, that's definitely occurring. If it is, there's no religion anymore, then they think it's definitely not occurring, right? And so for them, religion is progressing and it's changing with the times, and its social role is changing with the times, rather than it dissolving. And I think it's a really healthy way of thinking about it, actually. Okay, I need to clear these off. Never quite made 6 feet. Always a regret, though I had no control over it. All right, so neo-secularization theory, right? And we're here going to turn to, I think, the person who there's a bunch of people kind of writing similar things at the same time. But I think Chavez is the one, and again, Chavez was, or I think he still is, a scholar at University of Notre Dame, which for whatever reason is a hotbed of religion, sociology of religion, because that's also where Christian Smith is. It's a great school. Chavez, University of Notre Dame scholar, and he writes this paper called, I can't remember what it's called, or Secularization as Decline in Religious Authority, I think is what the title of the piece is. So, Chavez basically says, yeah, if we define secularization as there's no religion anymore, that clearly isn't happening. However, if we define religion as a decline in religious authority, then that is clearly happening, right? And he says secularization doesn't just happen at the macro level. It can happen sort of at three different levels, and we'll talk about them each in turn, right? It can happen at the micro, the meso, and sometimes I spell that with an S, so you can use alternate spellings, and the macro level. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. Okay. And what he says is, and this fits nicely with Stark in a way, in the US, secularization seems to be taking place at the macro level, right? In terms of things like, declines in religious authority, but not as much at the micro level, right? People still broadly believe in something. Now, how durable that belief is going to be remains to be seen. And again, we'll talk about that when we talk about religious landscape. Okay, he cites Wallace and Bruce in talking about, so that's our buddy Steve Bruce, right? We already talked about him. In talking about institutional differentiation, right? And this is the idea that church now, or religion and religious institutions, are now just one institution amongst many. They're not the kind of uber institution, right? So it used to be that, you had your church here, and then your hospital, your school, your welfare system, your food bank, all sort of orbited around the church. And now, these are all just institutions in the constellation of institutions that we have in a society, right? Church isn't the core institution, it's that organizes all the rest of them. It's just one institution amongst many. Okay, so practices in the religious sphere now have only indirect effects on other spheres, such as business, politics, leisure, and education, and medicine, and stuff like that. And religious institutions have limited or no influence on other spheres of life, right? They can be influential with their own members, but for the most part, their influence is relatively limited. Okay, so the first of our three levels of secularization is macro level secularization. And this is where religion declines in the general social sphere, right? And like I said on the last slide, religion had been linked to all other social institutions, or many other social institutions, right? It was sort of the institution around which many of the other institutions in society tended to orbit. And that is not the case anymore, right? It's no longer running schooling, right? Hospitals are no longer staffed by nuns, right? And I mean, this is a fairly big change. When my mom was born, and my mom is, in her 70s, but she's not, I want to say not that old. It's not like she's been dead for 20 years at this point. But when my mom was born, right, in the 50s, the hospital where she was born was entirely staffed by nuns, right? In this case, German nuns for some reason. I don't know, that's why she tells it. That's the reason she doesn't have Mary in her name. All her sisters are Mary something else, because Catholics always gave the first name of their child as Mary. And the German nuns were like, we are not doing that. What is the child's actual name? So of my mom's sisters, and she's one of 9 girls in the family, she was the only one that didn't have Mary on her birth certificate, because of a saucy German nun. It's like, no, you French Catholics are stupid. Why are you doing that? Stop it. That is exactly what German people sound like, by the way. Please don't tell my friend Sandra that she sounds like that, but she totally does. I'm kidding. Sandra's lovely, and she doesn't sound like that. She sounds much worse. Okay, so social welfare as well. We talked about that, right? And religion is just one institution amongst many, right? So this is what is called differentiation, right? That's our macro level secularization. So, yeah, hospitals, schools, social welfare, they no longer exist entirely within the religious sphere. Now, this one is the one that's a little bit harder sometimes to get your head around. And this is what's called meso-level secularization, and for whatever reason, I always spell it with a Z. I think that would be the British spelling. But this is secularization within religious institutions, right? Chavez calls this internal secularization as well, but this is where institutions that, even today would ostensibly retain some kind of denominational or religious affiliation no longer operate along religious lines. So you can look at the Ivy League schools as an example of this, right? In terms of I guess some other ones like Duke and Notre Dame are not Ivy League schools, but a lot of American universities, specifically have denominational affiliations, right? Harvard is Calvinist or Christian Reformed Church, right? And still the big Christian Reformed seminary in the United States is Harvard Divinity School. Yale is Congregationalist. The Congregationalists don't really exist anymore in meaningful ways, but they also still have a kind of divinity school or, clergy training center. Princeton Theological Seminary still trains the majority of Presbyterians in the US. And then Duke, though not an Ivy League school and filled with some of the worst people on earth. If you've ever been to Duke, you know. Founded as a Methodist, has a beautiful Methodist cathedral at the center of the campus. It is quite awe-inspiring. And then University of Notre Dame, right, Catholic, and there's a lot of Catholic schools, Fordham, Gonzaga. You could, list Catholic schools and universities in the US. But things like, they don't generally make either curriculum or even administrative decisions based on theological concerns. I'll give you a really interesting example of this. So back in 2015, those halcyon days, one of the kind of very Catholic groups on campus at UND organized a petition. And basically what they asked the administration to do was, and the president, you have to understand, the president at University of Notre Dame is a Catholic priest. And he comes from a specific order, and that order's entire purpose is to run the University of Notre Dame, right? This is what they do. You join that order in order to be affiliated with UND. Okay, so what happened? The students, right, asked the administration, specifically the president, to ban porn, right, on the university's internet system. The university should block all the porn sites on the Wi-Fi and internet system at the University of Notre Dame. And this, garnered enough signatures that it went up to the president and to the Board of Governors, or BOG, and the Board of Governors said no. That this was a Second Amendment issue. That limiting porn violated free speech laws in the United States, and so it couldn't be done even if the Catholic Church doesn't agree. So the person who had to hand down this decision that actually University of Notre Dame is fine with porn and porn is great and everyone should have porn all the time, was a Catholic priest. So take that for what you will, right? But this would be meso-level secularization, right? An administrative decision that on Catholic teaching should be a complete slam dunk. They were like, and I think what was actually behind it is if we ban porn, nobody's going to want to come to UND anymore, like the top scholars, clearly all porn addicts, I guess, are going to be like, well, I would come and work at University of Notre Dame, but if I can't watch porn in my office in my off time, then, what's even the point of being a scholar? I don't know what the thinking was here. I'm just imagining, right? And so they made an administrative decision that have nothing to do with Catholic teaching. And Catholic teaching was sort of a secondary concern, right? Okay. Now, we see this too with, hospitals that either have or had religious foundings. Typically today operate principally on administrative and management procedures that are accepted broadly, right? And Catholic or other theologies are taken into account only in kind of secondary ways, right? And yeah, Catholic hospitals, by the way, if you cited the Grey Nuns or Misericordia Hospital in one of your answers, or religious institutions secularized, I did not give you those marks. and only because I've sat on the board of Covenant Health, and they talk about Catholic shit all the time. And I know how carefully they walk a tightrope on questions like abortion and MAID. So, you didn't get that, Mark. I'm sorry to say. And a few people did, I know, because I marked that question. So, Covenant Health Hospitals do not count.
It's
right?
always wonderful
I have a
when
video.
a successful
and
This is
childless
jokey.
alumnus returns.
Ho ho. 2 have departed. Oh dear. All right. So, sorry, this is Yale. And again, this is from The Simpsons. It's meant to just show on what kind of grounds Yale makes its decisions. And again, don't take offense. It's just a funny video.
It's always wonderful when a successful
and childless.
alumnus returns.
It's delightful how you take turns sniffing after my money.
Now here's a group that was established in 1909.
I hate modern music.
To the tables down at Maurice, to the place where Louis dwells, to the dear old temple bar we love so well.
The whiffin' poofs. I'll buy you a new library if you have them killed.
So many have tried to kill them.
But other smug jackasses in white gloves would just take their place.
We can't be stopped.
Well, I am here to offer you money. I'd like to endow a Department of Nuclear Plant Management.
Wonderful. Of course, we can't do nuclear.
Our students are highly entitled wusses.
You'd be creating a space for violence to happen. How about funding a chair in the non-narrative cinema of self-identified pansexuals?
What?
We also need to hire more deans to decide which Halloween costumes are appropriate.
8 deans should do it.
Is this still a coven of capitalism where evil money can acquire a patina of virtue?
Yes, that's in our charter.
But with an issue as heteropatriarchal as nuclear power, we'll have to hire multicultural empathizers, build a new safe space.
Not so fast. We insist on a chair of anti-nuclear studies and a nuclear-neutral curriculum pathway.
Absolutely, Teddy. We run all decisions past the squash team.
Also the fencing team, water polo, and Handsome Dan the mascot.
Release me, you hound.
Oh, yeah.
What's happened to this place? This was the home of ruthless media disruptor Samuel F.B. Morse. Who's his successor? That fellow?
Fellow, that word is cisgender normative, okay? You're worse than Hitler!
Too late for flattery. I'm not giving this school a dime.
Oh, Mr. Burns. Do love you. Okay. Wow, this slide has so much text on it. Okay. So, micro-level secularization. This is Chavez's kind of last major category, right? And this is your personal life. So, this is primarily a reflection of how people's religious beliefs affect their daily lives. And what is the role of religion in people's decision-making? Okay, so probably the example that I think most pertinent, that might say more about me than anything else, right, is things like if you think of how people make decisions compared to the religious teachings that their group have. And you can think here of, if we want to think of Catholics, and we must, right? Bless you. And birth control. Right? I don't know if it will surprise you to learn, depends on what you know. Contraception, right, in any form, is officially banned by the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church doesn't allow any type of contraception. They allow what they call natural family planning, but any kind of artificial contraception is not permitted. Barrier methods, chemical methods, anything else you can imagine, not permitted by the Catholic Church. That said, it's something like 98% of practicing Catholic married couples at some point have used contraception. There's like 2% of Catholics who actually follow official church teaching. My friend Jared is one of these people, and as I have noted in the past, Jared has 11 children. 11 children, right? Now, why, he's a good guy. Lovely. 10 girls, 1 boy. The boy was the last one born. I don't wonder why. Okay, so what does this represent? Well, it represents, I think, what Chavez calls microsecularization. Most Catholics, in making decisions about, family planning, are not really that interested in what the Catholic Church has to say, right? It's like, can we afford a child? Do we want another child, right? Is it going to interfere with our careers? Can we afford childcare? Is mom going to stay home? Like, all of these kind of secular questions are really the ones that play a role in, decision makings about family planning, and about what kind of contraception or non-contraception to use. You see this largely represented as well in a lot of Christian groups around things like medical assistance in dying. When it comes to official kind of religious teachings on assisted suicide, virtually all Christian denominations are against it and oppose it on principle, but Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox often make decisions about end-of-life decisions not based on official church teaching, instead based on kind of personal preferences and concerns about, pain management, about being incapacitated, being a burden on other people, and those types of things, rather than, hey, what did the Pope say, right? Which, again, not that the Pope isn't important, but in people's daily lives, in a lot of cases, the Pope isn't really that important, right? Even if they're, profoundly Roman Catholic. How many siblings do you have? I've never, I still haven't tried. If he doesn't write me back, it would just be such a heartbreak. So I'm just going to have to keep my fan feelings in my heart. Oh, cool. Good times. Mother is Catholic. Well, maybe if your mother wasn't Catholic, you never would have been born. Who knows? Okay. We have got 2 more theories on secularization and 20 more minutes. So maybe we can start and we'll introduce our next topic today and move into it. So we're going to talk. I didn't think I'd get through this much today, but that's good. Self-limiting secularization. And I know you missed him in the time that he was gone, but Stark is back, right? I know it's been like 20 minutes. But Rodney Stark is back, guys. Like I said, he's a giant of the field, and it's hard to get away from him ever. In that brief kind of dalliance with other thinkers, you missed Stark, but thank God he's back. All right, so Stark and Bainbridge in 1988 propose what they call a self-limiting model of secularization. And again, if you remember, well, I know it's been like 11 days now, I was talking about Bruce. One of the theories that Bruce's late secularization and religion is alien is arguing against is the self-limiting model of secularization. Now, self-limiting is deeply tied in with market theory, right? So, do keep that in mind. These theories are kind of deeply linked together in lots of ways. And they're all, this is Stark and Bainbridge. Stark and Bainbridge are market theory guys. And so, the self-limiting model is largely a reflection of market theory thinking about how religion works. Okay, so one of the things that Stark and Bainbridge propose in the self-limiting model of secularization, and you're going to see this again when after the next midterm, we're going to talk very briefly about a book that Stark wrote with Roger Fink called The Churching of America, where this is basically the model that Stark has in mind. But what he says is that, you get religions, right? Religions get formed and they become established. But what happens to religions in a lot of cases is as they get established, they sort of, shall we say, they want to get respectable, right? And part of the task of becoming respectable is shedding a lot of their otherworldly characteristics, right? So they actually become less supernaturally focused, right? And you can see lots of examples of this, right? If we look at kind of mainline Protestant churches, right, especially if you look at the clergy rather than the kind of day-to-day practitioners, one of the things that you, like, you know, the people in the pews rather, one of the things that you find is that a lot of the supernatural beliefs in, say, like Jesus being resurrected from the dead, belief in miracles, right, belief that you can pray and that, you know, you can expect, you know, an answer to prayer that's more than like a subjective feeling. A lot of those things decline, right, as religions get older, more established, and a little bit more, you know, let's say academic, but also seek kind of social respectability, right? So, now, keep in mind, a kind of Starkian aphorism is, what do people want out of religion? Well, they want religion, right? They don't want social programs. They don't want, you know, like a food bank. That's all nice stuff on the side. They don't even really want community in a sense. They really want that access to, in Smith's terms, superhuman powers. So when religions sort of de-emphasize that, they kind of lose their appeal, right? And people will leave, with poor people leaving first. Stark points, you know, to the case of Latin America being really instructive here, where the Catholic Church, in sort of response in like the 60s through kind of the 2000s, in response to a lot of growing socialism and Marxism in Latin America, the Catholic Church's response to this largely was something called liberation theology, which was sort of a blend of Marxism and Catholicism, which really emphasized creating like social programs for the poor. And what ends up happening in Latin America is, not absolutely everywhere, but in a lot of places, Brazil, Guatemala, I'm trying to remember, there's a few that are more resistant, but I know certainly Brazil and Guatemala are two of the main ones. Catholicism essentially gets outcompeted by much more supernaturalist-oriented forms of evangelical Christianity, particularly Pentecostalism, right? And there's lots of really interesting Pentecostal churches in Latin America that offer things like faith healings, and they're very, very attractive to people. So what happens, right? Poor people leave first, richer people start leaving as membership declines, and being part of that religion offers less social capital. And what happens then is you get a religious crisis, right? So you get a religious crisis, right? It's like, oh my God, people aren't going to church anymore, right? Everyone's turning away from faith. And then you get religious innovators moving into the space. And here, no, I don't have this on the next slide. I had it somewhere else in the course, I can't remember where. One of the things that Stark, you know, could point to, though he doesn't explicitly in talking about religious innovators, could be something like Methodism, right? So Methodism was explicitly sort of a reaction to the soul-deadening boringness of Anglicanism. How do I feel about Anglicanism? Well, I guess I just told you. Right, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, had gotten very stodgy, and by the, you know, in the 19th, I'm forgetting now, I want to say the 19th century, but I could be getting my dates wrong on the Wesleys. When John Wesley is active, and his brother, and it's going to bother me, I can't remember his brother's name. Anyway, the Wesley brothers are active at Oxford. They're seeing, you know, faith is really important to them, and they're seeing a decline in faith in England as the Church of England sort of loses its appeal to people, and people start kind of moving towards the exits. So, John and Charles, I think that's right. The Wesleys essentially found a branch of Anglicanism called Methodism. And Methodism, along with the Baptists, is involved in a huge religious revival that starts in England, then shifts over to the United States. And again, we'll talk about the Baptists and the Methodists, we talk about the Churching of America, but it is this huge religious revival that basically takes religion from a very low ebb to a very high place that sort of peaks out in the 1950s, right? By the time we finish these waves of revival, we're in the 1950s, and religion kind of is at a high point in both Britain and the US. So, religious innovators like the Wesleys, or like our Pentecostals in Latin America, emerge and they propose new forms of religious life. This attracts people, right? So people come, and then imitators come, right? So it's like, wow, that person is, started a very successful church. Well, I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to copy their thing and put my own little spin on it, right? And what happens is religious activity in the society increases. So, if I can put it in very crude terms, it's kind of a wave, right? Secularization is a sort of wave. You go from a religious high, the establishment of religions, they sort of get stodgy and boring and start to fall apart, and then you get a decline, you get a religious crisis, probably about here. People start to innovate, and eventually you get a kind of resurgence of religion. What's been in Christian terms referred to as a revival, and it moves to a high point, and then those religions get established, right? And they get stodgy and boring, and then they decline, and then you get another wave, another crisis, another set of religious innovators. So, secularization is self-limiting. And why is it self-limiting? Hang on, I gotta erase some squiggles. It's self-limiting because that religious crisis triggers religious innovation, right? And it brings new form of religion into the marketplace. And that drives a religious revival. And maybe if I have a chance, I got to pull some numbers from England and see if I can find some decent numbers. England and France in particular, people are starting to talk about, I think in England they're calling it the quiet revival. That we may be hitting a point where there's sort of the beginning of that ebb back upwards, with the UK having hit a very low religious point, but now there's some kind of interest coming back to religion. But we'll talk about that when we talk about landscapes, because it's a little bit of data that's kind of interesting, and maybe supports something like this self-limiting theory of secularization. Okay. Oops. Hang on. No questions. Cool. All right, the last one, I think. Yes. Post-secularism. So, this one comes from the mind of this guy. Very handsome. He's a handsome man. Don't you all think so? I mean, he's really old in this picture. This is Jürgen Habermas, right? Bless you. And Habermas, post-secularism, it's a theory I kind of include. It's one that I don't know, to be honest, if it has legs for me. But, you decide for yourself. What Habermas basically says, and he says this in Time of Transition, is basically that, we've sort of hit a point socially, right? Where secularism was pushing religious out of the public sphere into the private sphere. And essentially that has triumphed, right? That basically, yes, religion is now principally a private concern, especially in places like Europe, right? It's much less in the public sphere. And explicitly so in some places. They don't want religion in the public sphere. So it's repositioned religion into that private sphere. But now, because religion has been pushed out of its privileged position and its position of power, he says, in order to maintain things like sort of societal values, it's time to reinvite religion back into the public sphere, right? Religion hasn't disappeared, and the fact that it hasn't disappeared forces secular societies in the West to deal, with not just with the presence of revivalist faiths, certain forms of Christianity and Islam, but also with the kind of general notion that religion isn't going anywhere, right? That secularization or modernity hasn't eliminated religion in the kind of sociological formulation that are Durkheim, Weber's, Marx, and Steve Bruce's kind of envisioned that it might. Now, he's like, how do we invite religion back into the rationalist discussion of society? That remains a sort of open question, especially with, revivalist forms of religion. Maybe I can often, so our revivalist forms of Christianity and Islam often being sort of explicitly anti-modern, right? And if you look at, say, something like Latin Mass Catholicism, there's a lot of sense in the Latin Mass community that the villain is modernity, and that, turning the clock back to Latin is about kind of lashing out and back against modernity. So, given that, how do you invite religion back into a discourse? And I love this quote from Habermas too, which is why I have it up here. Because he suggests, and here you could probably think of, again, you can probably think again of causal mechanism number 10, deep culture and invisible religion. Right? So what does he say in this quote, which I think is really, really interesting? Okay, so egalitarian universalism, right, which is basically liberalism, which sprang from the idea of freedom and social solidarity. Oop, I have an eraser, not a highlighter. What a fool I've been. Sprang from the ideas of freedom and social solidarity, autonomous conduct of life, emancipation of the individual, human rights, democracy. He says is, let's highlight this, it's always fun, deep culture, invisible religion, the direct heir of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love, right? So as much as modern or late modern or postmodern societies might like to deny it, they owe much in Habermas's sort of understanding to both Judaism and Christianity, which is where you get this formulation of, it's a Judeo-Christian culture. I know some people quibble with that characterization, but Habermas is essentially making the same link here. The legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual criticism, or continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to it, right? And in light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. And this, and this is the part that, religious people usually like about this Habermas quote. So we'll put it in red. Everything else is just postmodern gibberish, right? So any attempt to qualify Western values outside of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love is postmodern gibberish. Okay, so I think, and again, I'll cite not Spider-Man Tom Holland. Right, not Spider-Man Tom Holland. This book that he wrote, and I've talked about it a couple times already in the course, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, right? This is the American cover, right, which is the Jesus of John from Salvador Dali on the cover. And then, you see the British cover, much more secular, The Making of the Western Mind. But basically the book is about how much of what we think of as core in the modern world is owed to, the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love as articulated, in essentially by the New Testament, by Jesus and by Paul. So, I think what Tom Holland is sort of reflecting in the book is a sort of post-secularism, right? A post-secular kind of view saying, okay, these ethics are core, and therefore we have to reinvite religion back into the dialogue if we're going to get anywhere. Okay, I think I'm going to go back for questions. No questions. I mean, I could load another slideshow, but it's going to take me half as long as we have left. So let's leave it there. We'll end 5 minutes early. Come hungry on Thursday for the rise of Christianity. I know in the one day between now and then, you're going to miss Rodney Stark, but don't worry, he'll be back. So I'll put it there for you. No worries. Oh.